Hello, Dr. Ayesha. Welcome to the Work podcast. So
Welcome,
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you for having me.
we are such huge fans of your Instagram account, Woke Scientist. There's so many questions we want to cover, but first, how are your DMs? Do you have a way to control all the crazy shit that you must get?
Ugh. No, actually, it's like it is just me. Like it is my personal account that used to be private with my friends, and you can literally still see it. You can see like my posts from undergrad when I was just like, you can actually see me just become like this slow public person where I just don't know how to handle it, and then DMs just become really overwhelming. But what's interesting, I think, is I do get a lot of messages from people that tell me like the direct impact or something of my work in their life. And I think that is the most valuable, but it's so hard sometimes for me to even read those because I have a hard problem like internalizing compliments or anything nice that's said to me. So it's funny because I read the shitty DMs sometimes and respond to them very easily because like I can, it doesn't matter what they say, I can take it. And I think that's like that's more related to trauma, right? Like I think a lot of people have a tough time taking nice things that enter their DMs sometimes.
Yeah. Wow. So you were born in Bangalore, India, if I remember that correctly, and you've lived all over the world. And I think your perspective, especially since you are a doctor, let's just like say you're Dr. Aisha. And you mentioned this in one of your Instagram lives last year, but what was one of the first things you noticed coming to America? I mean, there's a lot of things, but in the way that we treat disease and vaccines and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, in general, I think the two things I noticed is one, like the toxic positivity and the fake niceness that literally it's pretty generalized and how that and that language of like being nice and like just on the surface being positive about something is really used to like erase all of the issues going on around the world that just like get washed over because America is centered. And then because America is centered and because Americans don't actually know about what's going on around the world, and I'd say that's a pretty accurate general statement to make from being here 10 years now. Even people in like academic campuses are fairly unaware of global issues.
Mhm.
And that's like you're taking a very like small subset of the population that should be like most educated or whatever, right? And with vaccines and stuff, I think it's ironic because it's looked at in America. It was the only place I think I would have maybe seen it as obviously, but here there was this culture of looking at certain subsets of medicine, especially vaccines, as like this whole anti-vaxxer movement, not to be trusted, like essentially all of the science on it is not true. And I think for me, that was just like jarring. One, I mean, I was already aware of like the injustices and all of the pervasive, the actual medical system and the science that we use being racist and having, taken advantage and abused communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities in the States for centuries. And that's true. And that's justified mistrust. But I think this is where people have a tough time having any complexity or nuance. They really just want to follow binaries of like good or bad, right? Call something good, call something bad. It's easy. Listen to someone who tells you what to think. And that's essentially what I saw was happening in America that was so common. And I mean, this happens around the world. It's a very general theme for propaganda where you have some authority figure. In the case of like the anti-vaxxer movement, it was this one dude, Andrew Wakefield, who came here from the UK, and essentially just started like targeting certain subsets of people. And it was interesting because the subsets of people that were in the anti-vaxxer movement tend to be mostly white, privileged, socioeconomically privileged people that are at the forefront of this movement when it comes to like even all of the organizations that are anti-vaxxer like focused that are making money. And basically it's a whole industry now. It's a whole industry focused on how do we take people's vulnerability and distrust of like systems and the government and all of these other things that are very real, and then exploit that and monetize off of that, and then tell them something that's absolutely not true that can, in this case, end up killing them. but still, you know, like at least we'll make some profit, right? I think that was to me shocking. And I think mostly coming from India, where it's just like you just grow up like having infectious diseases just be a very integral part of your life. I think is just, and I think this is for a lot of people from the global South, right? Like we have like certain vaccines, like I have a scar that like other people have never got those vaccines because they haven't had to. Or you're not normalized to like people, you know, relatives or something passing away from like a fever or a cold. Something as simple as that, right? Like it's so crucial for us because to us, when we look at vaccines and antibiotics, for example, those are so basics, right? Like people understand them as like not even at the forefront of medicine, which they are, as lifesavers, right? Because they give you this lifeline for your community to basically have a shot, even. Aha, pun. And I think coming here, I just realized that ironically, how well vaccines worked is why now people don't think they work. It's literally a testament to how good they are. And that this American bubble and ignorance of not knowing what the hell is going on around the world, like they don't even know that around the world, like in the global South, like the number one cause of death is still infectious diseases. So your like frontline ammunition is always going to be vaccines and antibiotics, right? Or antimicrobials. So that's just like all, like that's billions of people that rely on these things, that understand them, like have to believe in them and trust them in order for survival. And here, because so many of these diseases are eradicated, because all of like, you know, there are so many people that are vaccinated and it's so accessible that it ends up leading to a certain subset of people thinking that they can actually have that privilege to even think about not taking a vaccine, you know? And that's really due to herd immunity, like because they're relying on the fact that most people do.
Yes. I was just telling Britt that I had an argument, and I'm really trying not to judge people, but I mean, come on. I had an argument with a friend about this topic of how I believe the reason why this isn't ever going to go away is because people aren't getting vaccinated enough. And she was so sure that I was wrong. And I'm like, well, why do you think we don't have polio and stuff like that? It's because we have vaccines. Like, what? It's crazy. And I really feel like this panini pandemic vaccine really showed the bigger truth, the bigger secret, the bigger conspiracy of our country, of the United States, is the privilege that we have, and also how everything is under colonial rule, our healthcare, our education. And it's really showing that in everywhere else in the world, they would love to have this vaccine. And here we are with three different choices, very American. And then you have people who choose not to get it.
And I think with like COVID especially, it was really easy to see how capitalism is colonialism, because the moment you had the vaccine come out, you had this massive like medical apartheid, global medical apartheid, where here people were like able to afford to not take vaccines, to the point where like vaccines here were rotting, right? Because they were way past their expiry date. And now people are thinking of booster doses and like a third dose, right? And I mean, in the meantime, it's still like, I think 2.7% of the rest of the world is vaccinated. And this was when it was the peak of like COVID, especially the Delta variant, like rummaging through India and rummaging through these like big countries that have a lot of people that do not have access to the vaccine. And ultimately, that just means they probably don't have access to like ventilators and enough other medical resources that are necessary for treatment. So that's why prevention is better than cure, right? It's kind of your front line. You hope that you can do that. And then seeing people kind of like not even, it's this cognitive dissonance, right? Like it's honestly the lack of critical thinking and this intellectual laziness that's in America, which is like they don't want to be able to explain, okay, so if this is how it, like, you know, vaccines are bad, blah 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 blah. So like what's going on with this whole medical apartheid? Why are like these colonial countries like the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia monopolizing all of these vaccines, making sure everybody in the government, all of the 1%, do have them, right? And the rest of the world, the global poor, don't have them. So how do you explain that, right? And it's just like, they don't even want to confront that because people like to just stick to their narrative, and it's so simple and reductive and just go with it.
You know, it's also so fascinating because someone called it Google University, right? We live in this world where you can Google, like there's so much information at our fingertips. But what that has created is a bunch of people who feel that they are experts in things that people went to school for 10 years, for 5 years, right? They had to deeply study. People who didn't pass high school chemistry, speaking with authority on how vaccines work, right?
Yep.
15 years later, right, where they've been out of high school for a very long time and probably couldn't pass it now for sure, and yet feel like they're authorities on this. And I think that's sort of a greater part of the Western problem too, is this like innate arrogance, right? That
Yeah,
comes
there is a lot of, I think that comes with, people don't understand that even if you are like a working class person that has maybe certain other marginalized identities, if you're American, like the power of a blue passport, I don't think people realize what that means, right? That if you're living in the head, like in the heart of the empire, you are allotted by default certain protections that could be the difference between life or death for people around the world, right? And especially as an immigrant, like actually having to go through seeing how fucking brutal the immigration system is and how it's like nearly impossible for people to get here, right? And for those people to get here to stay here, people do not realize, even being born here, what that means and how much weight that carries around the world. And I think, like back to what you were saying about people having this arrogance about information, I think one, it comes from this inherent American supremacy, right? Like we talk about white supremacy a lot, and obviously like this is a facet of that because America is like the new British Empire, right? It is the exact same like version of what like the English Empire was back in the 20th century when we're talking about like original colonialism. So now with neocolonialism, America is that big imperialist army that just goes around the world and just, you know, uses and exploits other communities for their benefit. But now it's called capitalism, right? It's a whole economic system. And I guess people don't realize that if you're growing up then at the upfront of it, where you're in America, then you're gonna be told over and over again through all these like media, through your education, through all of these systems of propaganda, essentially, that like America is the best, that, you know, and that like, that's really individualism also. Like they tell you that you are entitled to certain privileges, right? And there's this total lack of focus on community. And we know that like the global South and all other Black and brown communities, right? Communities of color are very collectivist. But here in America, that American culture is still dominant to where the collectivism isn't actually prominent even in communities of color sometimes, because it's the internalized like racism, it's the internalized issues that we are still trying to get rid of. And I think seeing people come into my comments and then, yeah, just like, just have opinions on things that are just like facts is interesting. And then actually think like that them having an opinion on the validity of a vaccine is just the equivalent of me having an opinion on the validity of a vaccine, right? But then I also need to point out to people that it's never a binary, right? It's never like yet good or bad in boxes, to where you will find people that are in the healthcare system, that are doctors, that have all the degrees, that are incredibly terrible people, right? That take advantage of their patients, that like abuse their patients, that neglect their patients. And that is a pervasive problem. Like the medical system, like I think people talk about it as if it's external to racism, like it's this like objective healthcare system. It's not. Like science and medicine gave birth to racism, right? You needed to create the concept of race. And who did that is science and medicine. They've provided the false like foundations to legitimize race. And that's how racism is literally a foundation, right? So they're integral to creating all of these systems of oppression. And I don't think people realize that it's never complicated, which is why you have to assess every single thing that you see with a critical lens. Like you have to use, there's no easy way out. And that's the thing. People here want easy answers. And I do think it's like this age of information where you can get stuff fast, right? Even as you're scrolling on Instagram, it's this like stimuli that you're getting that's so quick. So now people just want information fast. They want everything done fast. And that's actually like a capitalist culture, the like speed and like wanting to have everything happen really quickly and not having any like time, right? Because time becomes money and time is like monetized. So I think then people like don't want to actually take time to understand something, a concept, right? That's going to take time to understand. And I think like I firmly do believe that in order for any regular person to understand how vaccines work, how like they're like what are the issues that we're seeing today, what is medical apartheid, how does the healthcare system work, I don't actually think any of these topics are inaccessible. I think coming from the right person, and that's why like I guess I do what I do, that I try to break it down to like remove all the jargon and simplify it to where anybody should be able to understand it. But at the end of the day, then if someone that has, you know, the same degrees as I do, right, but is inherently a capitalist and is just like wanting to take advantage of people, they can do that, right? So you can't go into anything like just relying on some kind of stereotype or binary. So not all doctors are going to be ethical and have like their practices rooted in social justice, and not all, like it's never going to be that easy, right? So you have to kind of be okay with like learning. And I think that's the hard part. And that's not just vaccines. I'm seeing that as a problem with everything in America, like social justice. People don't want to actually understand like these concepts and how do I apply them into my life? How do I actually organize? Where in my community can I actually help? They don't want to learn that because it's too much. It's so much easier to just repost something on Instagram because it takes what, 2 seconds, and people think that's actually enough, right? So it's this, again, this need for speed and just like laziness that like no one wants to do the work anywhere. It's not just like medicine or anything. It's just like in their life, they don't want to do the emotional work, like emotional labor, right? To be able to like be a good person in their relationships. People just want easy answers. It's this, I don't know like how to explain it, but it's that concept of like, give it to me fast.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that our country will believe Joe Rogan over somebody like you, I think says a lot about where we are as a collective.
Yeah,
it says a lot in so many layers.
Oh yeah. I think, and that's
right?
just, that's typical like propaganda, right? Like people should realize and should learn that any system of disseminating information, whether that's like Hollywood or music or education or the government, is going to be used as a tool of the state, right? And ultimately, what are the interests of the state? That's going to be what's reinforced. And in order to get a bunch of people to follow like your rules, and all the while not realizing how fucking exploited they are, how abused they are, how beaten down they are, you really need to brainwash the hell out of them, right? And people do not realize that this is what you like grow up with. This is what you see everywhere. This is what you watch. This is what you listen to. And it's not going to be that easy to unlearn, but it's not going to like not, you can't get around it, you know? Like people, I think, try to skip these steps and try to just be like, okay, I'm just going to listen to this person because they're woke. And that's the other end of the spectrum, right? Because there are people that are extremely like progressive and like, you know, have all the jargon, the leftist jargon down. But when you really think about like the substance of what their work is, it's not actually rooted in reality, or it could actually be entirely anti-science, right? Where they're passing misinformation about vaccines to where, who is it going to impact the most? Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other communities of color, right? Like these are the communities that have the highest mortality and morbidity rates when it comes to not just COVID, but all infectious diseases. So when you're talking about vaccines and spreading misinformation about it, using any platform, what you're doing is essentially you are directly responsible in whatever deaths are going to happen as a result of that, right? And I think that's to me is just like, yeah, again, people cannot use, there is no formula to like understand something. You can't just say if I you know, consume information from a person that has these qualifications, I'm good. Like I don't have to use my brain. I can just like parrot whatever they're saying, and that's enough, right? No, it's like you have to understand what you're saying, to where now I can look at someone who supposedly has way more experience than I do, right? And either in like politics or in medicine or even in grassroots organizing, and I can still take what they're telling me, even if it's like really advanced and complicated, and evaluate it objectively, to where I'm like, wait, that doesn't align with like basic principles of anything. You know what I mean? And then come up with an opinion on, do I actually subscribe to this? And I think people don't want to do that.
Well, it's like you
You
said,
said,
critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which I feel some people might have missed that class in elementary school or whenever we were taught that, like how to take facts and like filter it down.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sorry,
People want,
Brittany.
yep.
no, you said something, you said a couple of, I mean, everything you said was super powerful, but uh, one is that people are parroting things, and I working in the wellness world, and as a yoga teacher, I would hear things from my teachers and then repeat them, right? Because why would they lie? Why would that not be true? And
Mhm.
then students would come up afterwards and ask a question about it, and then you'd have to answer them. So at some point you realize, oh, I actually have to know what I'm talking about. I actually have to do some research and not just repeat things.
Mm-hmm.
But something else you said, I think would be to help people clarify. You mentioned that because our system has proven itself untrustworthy, right? The government, what does the government gain by ensuring that people are vaccinated? What does the government gain by making all these rules and policies, right? So with this idea that our government is intentionally and inherently nefarious, how can people rectify that the vaccinations are safe?
Yeah, I think this is where it's important to kind of look at and kind of evaluate like where the injustices are happening, right? And this is kind of basic common sense. If we're in the middle of a pandemic and a vaccine comes around and it has like, I mean, data that's open to the public, like you can actually go read the original data set, right? And I actually think the way that these papers are written are not inaccessible to people. Like I think you can read it and make your own, like you can look at the graphs from these clinical trials and make an objective assessment, right? And then even if you have a distrust of like the FDA or whatever, okay, so then the fact that they're being disseminated, fine, like look at the people that you think have all this privilege and are hoarding all these resources. Well, they're getting vaccinated, right? So like, is that not enough? Like for you to understand that like, this is actually something that's going to save your life. And if it's not going to make a difference there, I think it's important to even think about like where are injustices in the system right now. Most of the racism and like homophobia and transphobia, everything in the medical system is happening on a personal level, right? It's when you go see a doctor or go get admitted or go to the ER and the experiences that you have, how you're treated as a patient, how you're evaluated and diagnosed and treated, and how like are your symptoms believed? And what are the outcomes of that, right? That more people end up dying. We know this. There's also studies showing that like, you know, Black women have a higher mortality rate when it comes to childbirth, right? That Black babies have like four times more likely to die from when they're born than white babies. But if they're taken care of by Black doctors, that actually goes away, right? That normalizes. So I think these concepts are basically telling us that it's not going to be something that's like thrust in your face, right? It doesn't actually make a lot of sense if this vaccine, if we're being so open about the vaccine being this tool that's going to save us, and in reality, it's this really like insidious thing that's going to like, what? Like, how does that make any, like, to me, it's just logic. Like, can you think this out loud? Like, say these things to yourself. Like, you think, all of these doctors and scientists that are taking the vaccine themselves, right? That are a lot of them are, and I mean, people that even like were at the forefront of coming up with the vaccine are people of color. So you're telling me that somehow they're all brainwashed and doing all of this for what? Like, and that's when people are like, oh, money, pharmaceuticals. And I'm like, see, again, it's the whole, like, they just want an easy answer. Like all pharmaceutical companies are bad, and anybody that's involved in any kind of like vaccine, drug, anything that's produced like that is bad. Well, I mean, as long as capitalism is alive, you're going to have to learn how to survive. And that's where people don't see that they're actually doing the thing too. Like you go to work, right? You have a boss. You like, I'm sure you when you get pulled over by a cop, you fucking do what they tell you to do, right? So is that
Right.
is that you then therefore being inherently unethical and being a part of the system because you're complying? No. So what you're doing is doing what you can to survive and to get your community to survive, right? So you have to make money to be able to like put the food on the table for your family. So in the same way, if we like in the healthcare system, as people of color in the healthcare system, as like leftists in the healthcare system, if our like role in our purpose in the world is to basically try to give access to our communities to these medical resources that are life-saving resources, I'm not going to be able to break down capitalism and then do it in the way that people want it to be done, right? That is something that we have to, like, that's not going to happen tomorrow. And we are working on that, right? But at the same time, what about until then, right? How do we until then make sure that all of these communities that have been disenfranchised for so long and deprived of access aren't actually not being given access simply because someone has a political opinion, right? It's ridiculous when you like think about it out loud. And this is where I'm just like, it's nearly impossible for me to have coherent conversations with these people. And it's both it's both people that are like, you know, in like quote unquote have like progressive values or whatever and are anti-vax, or people on the other side who are like, you know, believe in like science and everything, but when it comes to social justice, it's like, and politics, it's like no, right? Either side, it's really hard to have a coherent conversation, because what happens is it's really easy for me to point things out at the beginning and like the first minute that inherently they're contradicting themselves, right? It's so easy for me to point that out and point out that what they're saying is completely illogical, and then they shut down, because that's when, I mean, and this is literally what happens in your mind, you hit cognitive dissonance, right? Your brain has to somehow process the narrative that you've been fed your entire life and then internalize this new information that's coming at you and be able to transform that narrative, right? And some people can do that, and most people have such a tough time breaking from it. So this is where I've kind of realized, like, if people aren't willing to do the work that they need to do to like work on themselves and their self-awareness and actually be able to be people who can have like emotional intelligence and all of these other things that we sometimes dismiss, they're not going to be able to have a conversation with me where I'm actually going to convince them of anything, right? I know that when I start the conversation, like I know whether this person, and I know that even when it comes to like day-to-day things, right? We meet people and we know where they're at in terms of how asleep or unplugged from the matrix they are. Like there's this like spectrum, and it's like, where are you at? And you can tell based on that, you kind of like modify what you're saying, right? You kind of like figure out, what can I talk to this person about? And that's not just with, you know, vaccines, it's everywhere. Like that's what we do all the time. We have to assess where people are at. And it's kind of sad, but these people are, they think not being controlled by the government and whatnot, but they absolutely are, right? If you are ultimately then blindly believing what someone else says, how is that any different, right? And this is, again, like, it's so difficult to have that conversation. But I think it's not entirely mute. I think it's important for people that are in their spaces, right? So this is where I say, like, this is what allyship is. Like, white people should be doing the work because racism is a white problem and they need to be talking to their family and friends, right? Like, stop coming into our communities and trying to like think that anti-racist work is about hanging out with people of color. That's not what it's about, right? It's not about coming into our movements and like taking up space. It's like, who's working on your people, right? Because a lot of times what people do is like try to, oh, my uncle is racist, I'm just going to never talk to him again. Well, I mean, that's the problem though. Your racist uncle is running this corporation and ruining my life. So maybe you should actually talk to your goddamn uncle, right? So who that information is coming from is important. And this is why sometimes the easiest way to break that cognitive dissonance is if it's coming from someone you perceive to be non-threatening, right? You perceive to be quote unquote safe, and you trust them and you like have some sort of a relationship with them. And if they're telling you these things, it's going to be very different than me coming in and telling them these things. And that's sad, but that's just like how people are at right now under this like capitalist culture.
Yeah. Woo!
You came in with the fire.
No, I was like, we don't even have to ask any questions.
I, I also just want to note that when we talk about binaries, and Lauren's heard me say this a million times, I'm sure, but like I start to think, I believe actually very strongly that it's actually a circle, right? So that if one end of the spectrum is very extreme and the other end is very extreme, they start to knit together, and the beliefs start to blur. And I saw that when I went to pick up my gong from a friend of a friend, who was talking about this movement, this anti-vax movement, with which BLM was there, which I love, but like also the Trump people were there, and it was like, wait, what? Arguing together? Wait, what? And he was like, it's a beautiful thing, and I was like, is it, or should we all be concerned?
Yep. And I think these are people, I think in general, people, it's sad because it's really an outcome of how abusive capitalism is, right? Like, because so much of everyday life is just like brutal. Like people have to, everybody has to put up with a lot, right? If you're working class, which is 99% of us, that you're just, going to be this cog in the machine. And sometimes all you have in terms of your dignity, or like how you think your self-worth, what you think is a measure of your value, is being right? Like that's sometimes all you have. And so when people go into these conversations, they cannot be wrong, because then everything's gone, right? Like they have nothing then. So it's kind of, it's really sad for me to even see, because it's the problem, right? But at the same time, I know and I understand why they're in that mental headspace, right? And why it's so hard for them to be able to break from those confines and actually start to be able to understand that, like, you are a human being and you're capable of being right and wrong, and you're capable of making mistakes and doing great things. And there's no way around that, right? Like people really want to cherry pick the positive. And that's also very American, the whole positivity thing.
Can we talk about the wellness and spiritual influencers who have all of a sudden become virologists and immunologists? All of a sudden, they were selling essential oils and teaching yoga, and now they're telling people not to. And for some reason, it was the vaccine, right? Like it was that really triggered everything. What have you noticed? I don't know even where to start with this question.
I think, I think even aside the vaccine, I would kind of allude to like these, it was, I think largely after the wave of publicized, I would say, police murders last year, that there was this whole wave of accounts that popped up, right? And everywhere, like, and a version of that is happening in every space, not just social media, right? All these people that want to now take advantage of these, like a lot of people, right? A lot of people who genuinely maybe want to do something and take their energy and then channel it like uselessly towards making more money for themselves, right? Monetizing off of that energy. And the easiest way that's happening is, I think, the wellness spaces, where people are because of like their life being so miserable under capitalism, and because them being constantly devalued and undermined, that then they look for spaces that on the surface superficially seem to have the language that's about uplifting yourself, right? That seems to be something where they're telling you messages that sound like they're going to validate you, that sound like they're going to tell you something good that you want to internalize. So you get attracted to these spaces. And that's the same thing with these anti-racist accounts, quote unquote, where you want to do something, right? Because you realize how you've been complicit your whole life. And in search for that, then you see these accounts that are using the like right leftist jargon. And then you basically like want to just internalize whatever they're saying, right? But this is where there's no shortcut to doing the work. Like you actually have to understand these concepts and evaluate them objectively for yourself, because there's no formula to figuring out who's like giving right information and who's not, right? Because those wellness accounts Like, you know, like I can think of like the holistic psychologist being like the biggest account that I can think of. And I think there's basically accounts that talk about either mental health or trauma or neurodivergence, or I think like body, like positivity stuff, or even body neutrality stuff, and anything related to wellness, like you said, body, mind, and emotions and soul. Like I think people have taken that, start using this progressive lingo, right? Start using the right words and use that to lure people in. But then what they're actually doing is their actual information, their substance is inaccurate and also very insidious, because when it comes to wellness accounts, what they do is try to give people advice on how to live their life, right? That's exactly what wellness accounts are. Yeah. And with that, you have so many people, then millions sometimes, internalizing these messages about how I should feel about myself, how I should feel about the people around me, and therefore how I should exist. And a lot of the times these insidious accounts are telling people that they're completely alone, that all of the work that they need to do in terms of taking care of themselves is only have to, like, it's only about them, right? It's only this hyper emphasis on self-care and self-reliance, and any kind of reliance on your community is called codependence. Mm-hmm. And like, these messages are actually extremely damaging, because then you do the exact opposite of what you need to do to heal. You do the exact opposite of what you need to do to be like a person that's able to grow and evolve, right? You're cutting yourself off from your lifeline, which is your community. And ultimately they do this because it's easy to take advantage of people that are isolated. And we know that, like politicians do this, right? And it's easy to get them to believe what you want them to believe once they're no longer like with their support systems. So then what you can do is monetize off of them, right? You can sell them your book, you can sell them your essential oils, you can sell them whatever the hell. And that's like the end game. And I think people recently realized that it's not just about even selling things to them, it's even more insidious. It's even more like bigger than that. And I think this was when they looked into certain accounts, including the holistic psychologist, and found out that they were related to white supremacy groups, and actually collaborating and conspiring with them to spread certain types of messages. And messages, for example, like if you are, experiencing trauma or whatever, if you've experienced trauma, that somehow that gives you a hallway pass to anything else, right? That, you can be problematic. You don't have to be anti-racist. You don't have to be like working on intersectionality of any kind, because you're like, it's justified. Whatever you are is justified, right? And then this whole accepting yourself, right? Using that kind of language to be like, you actually, like, what you're talking about. Like, you actually do, like, it's things that we, on one hand, can use to empower people, but on the other hand, can be used to easily exploit people. Yeah. So the only common denominator here in terms of a solution is, the only way we're going to get out of that cycle is if the people themselves decide, wait, I'm not going to be taken advantage of, and I'm not going to put anybody on a pedestal and idolize them. And I'm going to take information and do the work that I need to do, right? That's the only way out of it, because you will find people of all kinds that have whatever beliefs that you think are okay, that have this whole other thing to them that's not okay. And that's just how it works.
Whoa. That, I just got chills, and I'm really creeped out by what you just shared. I didn't know it was to that extent, and how sophisticated that is. Mm-hmm. Damn.
Yeah, it's really upsetting, and it just reminds me of this, the very first book I read on veganism was A Skinny Bitch. Yeah. And one of the chapters is called Trust No One. And that just keeps popping up like at every turn, trust no one. I think that the problem is, though, is that people have a hard time understanding that you can learn from someone who's an expert in something and not give all your power away.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right. That you can, and even learning something from an expert, like, and also this is where that's a difference. That doesn't mean you can fucking Google something and also have mastery of it, right? The common denominator is, have you done the work, Like,
Yes.
have you actually spent the time, labor, and energy that is needed to work on first yourself before anything else, right? Like, if you're like, literally, this is something now I'm realizing more and more that people are not aware of, is like liberation starts from you first. Like, you undoing the injustices you've internalized, because you've internalized so much, right? And it doesn't matter what identity you are. That's where identity politics is blocking like any kind of change. Like, I don't care about any identity. Everybody has to do work on themselves, right? To rid themselves of all of the internalized messages that they've internalized over time as they've been socialized, right? We're born, the moment we're born, we're socialized. People tell us how to think. People tell us like what to believe in and how to live our life and what to do in life that makes you quote unquote successful, right? And you're told that every day, all the time, for hours sometimes, because you're spending 8 hours in school, right? What are you taught? Exactly that. So it's not going to be easy, but this is where if people aren't willing to start with themselves and all they want to do is like go do the work somewhere else and tell, like, that's a form of, again, superiority complex and a supremacy like mindset, right? Because the only reason you want to do the work is so you can tell someone else that they're wrong. And
Yep.
like, and it's like, what? Like, you're just, how is that any? And this is why, like, the way it looks like on a bigger scale is this is why people that are oppressed sometimes go on to oppress themselves, right? And the cycle then continues, and you just have this like, but at some point you need someone divesting from the cycle. You need someone, and that's what abolition is, but like, you need someone saying, no, I'm no to all of this, right? And not replicating these cycles. And it's so hard to like get people to see that they're actually doing the things that they think they're against.
You said in one of your IGTVs again, or Instagram posts, that we are inherently colonialist. Like, the way that this country was founded and created was by a bunch of white dudes who wanted to make some money and took some things from people. And I'm saying that very lightly, obviously. Um, and I think what you just said, I think some people think that they are divesting from the system or the paradigm by not listening to scientists and not listening to pharma and the government. Um, and you might have said this throughout our conversation, but in order for us to divest in these harmful structures that we're currently living in, how can we do that? But also, first, like, um, know what's true, and also, yeah, like, know what's true, and like who to even believe in anymore. Because I feel like that's what's getting all of us so confused, is not knowing who to trust and not knowing what data to trust.
Yeah, I think this is where, because there's no system, and this is what like is again, a product of capitalism, right? They call it the quote unquote free market, um, where anybody can do whatever the hell they want as long as they're able to monetize off of it, right? There are no rules to, and this is why like the anti-vax movement is an industry, right? They can actually make a documentary that is so dangerous, that is spreading total like false, fabricated information and lies, and make money off of it because they release it, right? So this is where capitalism has no ethics. Right? There's no rules, there's no like boundary of what is like moral and what's immoral, right? Capitalism inherently has no morals or ethics, which means that all you have to do is make sure that your idea is profitable. So I think this is where people have to first be able to come up with like things for themselves that they can use as tools to evaluate like how worthy is this piece of message when it comes to me like understanding it or believing it, right? And I think the first thing that, again, it goes back to like, have you done the work? Like, have you done the work, not even just to learn information, but have you done the work to actually being an open person? And that's something that's so simple, but most people aren't, right? Most people do not have the ability to assimilate new information in their head and like actually incorporate something novel, especially if it goes against their narrative, right? Most people cannot do that. And that's what emotional work is, right? It's being able to understand complexity and being able to take criticism, being able to grow from your mistakes. All of this internal work, that's what it's about. Like, I know a lot of wellness accounts just make it about like living life and being happy. No, it's about actually like doing that work so you can then go change the fucking world, right? It starts from changing yourself. And I think once people, I've realized at least that once people get to that point where they're able to actually have conversations that are tough and sit with uncomfortable emotions, right? Because what happens when I'm telling them something that they don't believe? They get defensive. And why do you get defensive? Because you think I'm encroaching on you as a person, right? They personalize it, right? And that's all going back to, are you self-aware? Like, are you aware of what you're saying and what you're doing? And it's asking yourself something as simple as like, why am I doing the things am I doing? Right? Like, why do I want to have this job? Why do I want to get married? Why do I want to have kids? Why do I want to live this house? People don't ask themselves why. They just do. Right? And as long as people just do that, it's impossible to have a conversation with those people, because there has to, I've kind of seen that there's a moment in people's lives where they kind of decide, essentially, like, I'm going to start being self-aware, right? Something happens or something falls apart, or it's something that pushes them over the edge. And that's where they're like, and we call that, and on the left, we call that being radicalized, right? You see like the extent of injustice in the world, or you understand that you yourself have been complicit and you actually use that to like make you a better person, right? And then it's so easy to tell them how like they can go into a conversation and assess objectively for themselves, right? Because then you can actually internalize information and you can not just assess it for yourself, but if you see something else tomorrow that's different, you can also take that information in and like see for yourself what actually makes sense. Because the one thing I realized, like going through academia or whatever, is everything in the world is actually pretty simple. Like, what we like to do as human beings is like try to make ourselves look smarter. So we need big words, right? And this is everything and everywhere. This is everything from politics to medicine to people in their daily lives that use jargon in like conversations, right? To seem smarter. And what we're doing is essentially taking a very simple concept and making it so complex to where we're using it to, again, for superiority, right? And I think if people are genuinely able to get to the point where they're self-aware of their actions and why they hold the beliefs that they believe, why they believe the things that they believe, and understanding that you've been socialized your whole life, right? Like really understanding that, which means everything could actually be a lie. So like, that's fine, right? That's okay. So you can't cling on to anything. Like don't die on any cross, right? Like you don't have to. Like it doesn't make any sense to do that, right? Politicians don't need you defending themselves. Celebrities don't need you defending themselves. Like relax, like actually evaluate ideas, not people, right? And once people get to that point, I think they're actually able to understand complex things, because then they can take something complex and be like, oh, okay, so this is kind of like this, right? And they simplify it to something that they can actually understand, or like consume it from a person that's an expert that's able to then make that information accessible. But it doesn't matter, for example, how, like, that's what I do. I basically like break down complex, either like political stuff and social justice stuff or science. But at the end of the day, one thing that's in common is once I simplify that and like deliver that message, the people that are not willing to internalize it will never internalize it. It doesn't matter if I say it in the most complex form and throw a bunch of data at them, or if I break it down to a level to where, and I usually have a metric to where I tell myself, like, if I deliver a concept or an idea or communicate something, I need to be able to do it so that I can get like a child to understand it, right? And if I can't, then I don't know what I'm talking about well enough. And I think, like, I've seen that I have been able to like get like kids, like I'm talking like 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, to understand these messages, to where adults, right, in my like thousands of people in my comments or whatever, are just like, it's like a wall, right? They're just like it's total lack of logic, total lack of reasoning, total lack of intelligence. And it's just like, this child is able to actually do that. But why? Because they haven't been socialized as hard yet. right? So their mind is actually fundamentally still more open than that of an adult. And they're willing to learn, they're willing to understand the world, right? And that's the saddest thing about adulthood under capitalism, is you close yourself off from learning anything new. And as long as you're like that, okay, well, nothing is going to get through. It doesn't matter how complicated, how simple, and who it's coming from, right? As long as you're convinced on believing what you already believe, that's it. Or if you're looking for easy answers, and that's like another subset of people who don't have any convictions, right? Who like don't have any like strong political beliefs, or don't have any kind of a clear idea of who they are and what they believe, that they're looking for those answers, they're in search of those answers, and then they're easy to take advantage of, because again, they want, at the end of the day, easy answers, right? They want someone to tell them how and what to do and what to believe in.
Yeah.
So they're the like other kind of people that then again are impossible to get through, because once they believe in that thing that they think has saved them or like gotten them this like light in their life, again, they cling on to that and they're unwilling to let go. So it's the same thing either way.
Yeah. Well, capitalism is a very well-oiled machine. It thrives on a population of people who are sick, who are not as educated. I think what you're trying to say is also that Americans are kind of dumb. Another guest on the podcast said that the energy of Americans are like childlike, like we're very immature. And I was like, that's very true. And it's easier to control a population of people if they feel lonely and scared and isolated, which I feel also is what also happened during the pandemic, is got everybody to stay at home. I think people are inherently collective and community based, and it almost amplified people's fear of death as well. Which in, like other cultures around the world who are more collectivist based, we have an understanding that death moves beyond the body. At least that's what I was taught. So then you have all these people who are stripped away from their spirituality and their idea of not even like their denial of death. And then it's easier to be in that conspiracy mindset of they're going to kill us with the vaccine. They're microchipping us.
Yep.
Oh my God.
I think, and that's classical again, like that's just an outcome of propaganda, right? Like this is where oppression is actually pretty simple if you think about it, because the ways that it's done are so simple, and it's the same thing over and over again, right? So how do you get a population to like, again, basically be asleep as you're taking advantage of them? You need to scare the hell out of them, right? To where they will believe whatever the hell you tell them, because then you become the savior, right? And that's what the government is, right? The government becomes the thing they can turn to as opposed to each other, because you drive this like, and through, it's simple, right? The fear mongering, like through the news and through everything from TV shows to movies, right? As long as you get people to fear the other, whatever the other is, and fear each other, then you're the only person they're going to turn to. And the person being the entity that is the government and the state. So that's literally what every like authoritarian state does to be able to like inflict all this harm on people, right? And that's what America's doing. And I think that's also ironic that people don't understand that America is just like any of those other like dictators and authoritarian states. The only thing is just has better PR. Like it just looks nicer on the surface, you know?
Yeah. And it's a little more subtle. It's not like as outrageous as like some other empires in the past.
Yep. And I think it's so big. And I do think oppression in the scale of how brutal it is and the toll that it has, we are absolutely at our worst right now. And that's saying a lot, because it's almost like oppression has been streamlined, right? Where we've actually created this global production line, and everybody is part of this production line, and everybody is involved in each other's oppression, and everybody's complicit. But usually people use that to then like yield this learned helplessness, right? Where when people learn that information, where people like see how powerful the state is, or see how powerful corporations are, or the 1% are, and see how they themselves are these pawns that are, taken, exploited, and at the end of the day used to exploit others, they use that to incapacitate themselves, which I think is sad, right? They use that to be able to tell themselves that nothing can change and I have the inability to do anything about it. When to me, the idea that we're all involved is actually liberating, because it means you can let go of the whole I'm right, you're wrong. We're all our hands are bloody, right? So we might as well like get down and do the work, because everybody's involved. So I can't actually judge you or you or you, right? It doesn't matter, because we're all complicit. And I think that is like where we need to get to in terms of like a critical mass that's needed for an actual revolution.
So is that the work that you suggest white-bodied folks and BIPOC folks need to do collectively together, is to just get to that space of accountability?
Yeah, I think collective accountability and individual accountability is something that people don't understand at all and and this is something, and I think the most important thing I've realized is people think changing the world is like doing something massive, right? Like starting an initiative, a movement. That's not what it's about. It starts with you trying to be a better person. And if you're not able to do that, you're not going to do jack. And like, I can assure you, right? You are going to, if anything, if you go in with that arrogance into movements, you're probably going to do a lot of damage. And I don't think people realize that, right? Because a lot of times people that have never done this work before, especially allies, come into this sort of work wanting to do something to help and having this energy, right? But at the same time, they don't realize that like the way they can help is by doing the work themselves and like working on themselves and their like people around them, right? And the way that looks like is work on your everyday relationships. Like, do you represent basic social justice values in the relationships you have in your life? How do you treat the people around you, right? If you're a shitty person and you're like, you just inherently have that ego everywhere, like, what are you going to do in terms of like going out into the world and trying to quote unquote change it? You're just using it to make yourself feel better about how great you are, right? So it's like working on yourself and the people, like actually investing in your relationships around you makes you humble. Like it humbles you to just see how flawed we all are. But if anything, again, that's liberating, right? Because everybody makes mistakes. Everybody is complicit in oppression. Everybody has moments where they've done something that they regret, right? So to me, what that means isn't that like, oh, I'm better than that, or I'm like, I need to be perfect. To me, it's like, I think being like getting closer to my own self-acceptance has been okay with just being human, right? Because when you like reduce yourself to just that, then you're able to be like, okay, so I don't have to be right. I don't have to prove a point. I don't have to go out there and like be the strongest, smartest, loudest, whatever. I just have to do like play my role that I have in society already. And people don't see that. Like revolutions start with people doing the work they need to do in their spaces, right? Like marching on the street isn't actually going to do the work that you think it's going to do, right? What it's going to, like, what's actually going to do the work is if you take and evaluate your life and you think about, okay, like, what is my job? Okay, I like education and I'm a teacher. So how can I use that as a tool for change? How can I decolonize education? How can I decolonize my classroom? How can I like actually like bring these ideas into everyday things, right? Because that is how revolutions start, not from like these, like, I guess these simple things that people think they need to do to like change things.
Ayesha, what's your message for the world at this time?
Oof. I think it's a sense of urgency. I think if anything, what I've realized is that people are not aware of how close we are to barreling towards extinction, right? Like, and that's literally it. Like, people do not realize that there is going to be a point where there's no turning back, and we're really close to that. And that's all in terms of understanding how exploitive capitalism is, not just of people, but of like the land, resources, water, and everything, right? It can take anything and profit off of it, not just people. So I think it's really important for everybody to like realize, okay, like I'm not just trying to work on myself and then like trying to do something in terms of being involved in transforming the space that I'm in, to just like, it's not just about, you know, justice in terms of like getting like equity in your country or in your community, right? It's literally at this point about like, if we do not do this, if we don't get our shit together, and if we don't have a way to get over ourselves, honestly, and figure out a way to be able to like build solidarity and build bridges, we're like the earth is going to barrel towards extinction, and there's no way around it, right? And it's ironic that even though we are the 99%, that we don't understand that we're the 99%, right? Like even that's the one thing that oppression does. The oppressors are usually the small minority of very powerful people who are only powerful because, one, they're hoarding wealth and resources, but at the same time, they're truly making people, the masses, believe that they're powerless, right? And that equation is really important. So I think it's important for people to understand how much power we actually do have, right? And within ourselves, in our own spaces, and then therefore as like a collective, that we absolutely have the numbers. Yes. And that also means we have the capacity, we have the resources, we have the intelligence, we have like the knowledge that we need, we have all of it, right? And we have more than they could ever have, because what they're doing, the motivation behind it is power, right? The seething need for power. But if there's one thing that I've learned is like, there is like, as long as you're seeking power and authority, those are not going to be good enough as a motivator at some point, because the most powerful form of motivation is love. Like that is the greatest motivator, right? And people die for that. Yeah. And that's not the kind of motivation that goes behind like the like seeking power, right? Like to be able to like have people fear you is one way to get power, but then to have people like respect you because they love you and they care about you and they trust you, that's way more tangibly powerful. Like people are willing to do a lot for the people they care about, right? So it's not about power. At the end of the day, it's like we have something they absolutely don't, which is that we're actually doing this for the right reasons. Right. So as long as we realize that, like, that just means that collectively and even individually, like there is something beyond money, right? Money's not real. At the end of the day, like we're real. The things we interact with are real. The land is real, like water is real, plants are real. So as long as we focus on how do I like just think about what I can do with the tangible things in my life, and not like mystify it, not make it like this big beast that you have to tackle, right? Start at home, start with yourself, start with your like workplace, start thinking about like if you are actually just and fair in your relationships. If you're not, how the hell are you going to implement justice anywhere, right? Like, do you embody your principles? I think that's like a very simple question to ask yourself. Like, and if you don't, then get there, because if not, we're all going to die.
Oh my God.
I love that.
Oh,
I loved your message, but at the like the reality check at the end.
Yeah, I think I realized that it's this weird thing where like the more I've understood how the world works and gotten like the knowledge and expertise, the more jaded I've become. And the more I'm just like, oh my God, I just hate everybody and everything. But at the same time, I love everybody. So like, how do I, it's weird. I can like oscillate between this dark, like we're all going to die, and somehow still use that to be like, let's fucking go. Right? Like, and that's the truth. And that's what complexity is. Like, I can't like cherry pick, right? That is the damn reality, but I can still find fucking something beautiful in that. Right. And if you're able to get to that point where you can do that in your own life, where you're able to sit with the uncomfortable emotions, where you're able to see like that light can only come after darkness. And you wouldn't even know what the hell light is if you never experienced darkness, right? So people are running, like really what it is people aren't just running away from accountability, they're running away from themselves, they're running away from uncomfortable emotions, they're running away from accountability at any scale, and they're running away from being wrong, right? And when at the end of the day, the irony is if you ran towards accountability and you ran towards all these things, chances are you're going to end up experiencing like all of these spectrums of human emotion and go through life and actually be happy, right? Because there's no way around it. Like you can't, it's ironic because the chase of positivity actually yields nothing. It yields the opposite, right? It yields darkness. And the chase of like this constant, I need to feel good, I need to only have these positive emotions, again, that's going to lead you to having something that's very dark, which is usually the lack of emotion, right? Like you can't cherry pick anything. And this is where, again, nothing is a binary, right? Either you take all of it or leave. Like, and it's really that, like, take it all or just walk away from all of it, because you're not going to be able to just get the good.
You don't subscribe to the yoga philosophy, the neo-Western yoga philosophy that says, take what you need and leave the rest.
Yeah, no, I don't even know what that means. Yeah, I think that's one of those like white messages again that people are like passing. You can't take what you need, right? Like it's again, like, are you willing to take the things that you don't need? Like, are you willing to consume things you don't want, right? Like, and I think for me, the one thing I've realized as I've learned more is how little I know. And the more I've learned, the more it's made me open to being wrong about something that I firmly believed in before, right? But that's like just being human. How the hell can I know something if I was never taught it? How the hell can I know something if someone didn't actually like hold me accountable and catch me, right? And try to get me to learn this information? How would I know? Like you don't know what you don't know. So it's okay, right? It's okay to be wrong and just learn and move the hell on. And I think people just get stuck in the I'm wrong and never move on from that because their ego is so dominating then. And that's what like individualism really does, right? Like capitalism makes you focus on yourself so much to where it actually makes you so lonely and isolated and incapacitated and stuck that you never actually experience anything for yourself. And at the end of the day, you don't realize that you need to be in community in order to even feel anything. Because what the hell is the point of the world if I'm just existing in a vacuum with nobody else? Like, why would I be there? Right? What's the point? Like, why? I don't know why I would exist. So then why do we all exist? Because people. At the end of the day, that's what it is. Like, I don't want to live in a vacuum. And I don't think people even question, like, why do I do the things that I do? Why am I alive?
Wow. I feel like we should leave it at that. Dr. Ayesha, wow, what information. And also, if you want to support the woke scientist, Dr. Ayesha's Instagram, you can, we're going to link all of your Venmo and all of your information in the show notes, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. This was
me.
juicy.
Yeah, this was great.
Thank you.